Whether you play tank, DPS, or support in Marvel Rivals, you are making vital mistakes that's costing you games and preventing you from carrying your team. If you want to get better at Marvel Rivals and climb, you need these 3 tips for every single role so you can get better, start to improve, and quickly dominate the ladder. Now I want to thank each and every one of you because we hit 100,000 subscribers, which has been a dream of mine for a very long time. But if you haven't already, definitely check out our second channel, Coach Mills 2, where we're going to be posting more guides, tier lists, and more like this video right here. And there's a lot you're not going to want to miss on that channel, so check it out and subscribe. But let's get back into it. Now I'm going to give you tips on tanks, DPS, and supports, but I would highly encourage you to watch it on every single role. Even if you don't play the role, you're going to learn a lot, and it's going to help you be a better teammate and a better player by understanding what every role does, how they should play, and tips and tricks on each one. Now, first off on tank, you need to understand the idea of pushing and pulling. So what I mean by this is a tank's job is to take what we call space, which is the areas on the map that you want to occupy, control, deal damage from, heal from, and pretty much every place that you could actually contest or be on, that is space. And a tank that creates a lot of it allows their teammates a lot of different options. If you're ever in a game that feels like no matter where you go, what you do, enemies are there, and you almost feel claustrophobic moving around the map, that's because there's no space, and it's a tank's job to create it, even if they are being assisted by their team. Now, the reason that's the case is because tanks are the characters that don't insta-die if they are not next to cover. They can just actually tank on damage. That's what they do, is tanking. And they won't instantly die because they have rather big health totals and typically some form of mitigation, whether it's a shield, a barrier, a bubble, whatever it is, it helps them do the job of being a tank. Now, the idea of pushing and pulling is pushing and pressing space when you have an advantage and pulling back when you have a disadvantage. Think of each team as 2 equally sized globs of like mass or power, right? And when they collide, they're typically trading damage, trading heals, trading abilities, and even ultimates. But eventually something gives. Eventually someone dies, someone gets picked, someone is low on HP, someone uses all their cooldowns. And as a tank player, you need to identify what team has what advantage and respond with your positioning accordingly. This means that if your team is at a disadvantage, you should be backing up, giving ground, and giving space. And the reason is because when 2 things collide, the thing that has less is going to get crumbled and fall under pressure. It's like if there are 6 people on one team and they run right into 3 people and those 3 people stand their ground, those 3 people are going to get annihilated. They're going to get eaten. They're going to get swallowed. But if those 3 people keep backing up and backing up and backing up, eventually those 6 might overextend. Maybe they go too far in. Maybe one of them goes too far in front of the pack and isolates themselves in a 3v1. Or maybe you buy time for your teammates to come back and regroup with you. So to understand this is to understand that a tank's job is to first and foremost identify the advantages and disadvantages of their team versus the enemy team. Understand the current state of the fight. You are the one that decides how you fight, when you fight, and where you fight every single time. And there are several things that you should be keeping track of, like the amount of numbers on each side, who's dead, who's alive. At any moment, if I turned off your screen or monitor, I want you to tell me how many people on the opponent's team is alive and how many people on your team is alive. That's a really important skill. Understand what's the health pool of all the people on the enemy team. Start tracking enemy resources like ultimates and even cooldowns. Because if you identify, hey, the Luna doesn't have her ice and the Mantis doesn't have her sleep, now they're vulnerable to a dive, I'm going to jump on them as Venom. Let's go jump on them together. These are things that you need to identify and ways that you can kind of decide when to push, when to pull, who has the advantage, who has the disadvantage. Now, the last bit I'll add to this is when opponents are investing ultimates that add a lot of power to their team. So like a Luna Snow ult adding a ton of power to their team. You got to think about it like this. If there's 6 people alive and they're Luna Snow ulting, now there's 6 people alive that have a ton of health or extra damage, right? And so that means that they have increased that advantage and strength of their team immensely. And what does that mean? If their team is now, instead of like a 6 of power, it's a 7 or 8 of power, do you want your team of 6 or 5 to run into that? No, because the bigger amount actually always wins, right? When they collide, the bigger amount of power will win. So what do you do as a tank? You back up. You allow the enemy to push in. You allow the enemy to invest the resources. You give ground as much as you possibly can until those things end. The ultimate ends. The thing stops. That is what's super important. if you run face first in to opponents doing that, you are forcing your team to fight in a situation that you're not gonna win because you're at a huge disadvantage. The next up is the idea of corners and cover. A tank has mitigation abilities, and they also have the ability to tank damage and not instantly die. But that being said, you can't do this for a very, very long time. Oftentimes you have cooldowns that protect you. Oftentimes you need to give your supports time to heal you, and this means that you need to be playing around corners and cover. Natural cover are the areas on the map that not only block enemies' line of sight, but also block damage. And ideally, you want to be standing around a piece of natural cover so that if you need to, you can stop fighting an opponent temporarily while your team actually heals you, brings you back to full, or you get your cooldowns back. If you are engaging enemies in the open 24/7, you are going to run out of your natural resources, you're going to run out of your cooldowns, you're going to force your supports to pocket you, and you're going to fall over and die. And the fight's going to be lost because of you. And you could be saying, hey, I'm standing on the objective, I'm doing what I'm supposed to. But oftentimes, every time a tank is accomplishing something, it needs to be done in waves based on their health, their cooldowns, and their team's resources. Just like we talked about the pushing and pulling of a team fight, there is also a pushing and pulling of you yourself being capable of fighting and not fighting in any given moment. There are going to be times that you don't contest an objective. There are going to be times when you let the opponents have a tick or push an objective to a certain point because you are not ready to fight yet. Because once again, we talk about advantage, disadvantage. In your current state with low HP, a support that can't pocket you, and no cooldowns, you do not want to run into a force that has more things than you, right? You want to kite, back away, prevent the fight, or delay it until you're ready to fight on a level playing field or even an advantaged one. This is the core idea behind tanking in general. The idea of fighting when you're ready to fight and not fighting when you don't want to fight at all, and positioning in a way that allows you to decide those things. So having a piece of cover next to you, having a corner next to you means that if you want to back away and you want to use a piece of cover to protect you temporarily, you can. And one of the things that's super strong to do is play around the corners of areas and chokes. If enemies are trying to funnel through a choke or round a corner, you can use that corner to protect you, because the corner forces an enemy, if they want to chase you around the corner, to isolate themselves from the supports that are following behind them. If you're playing a corner and the corner is within the line of sight of your supports, for instance, and the opponents try to push through that corner or around that corner to continuously deal damage to you after they get you low, they are going to be leaving their support's line of sight right into your team's line of sight, which means that you have a fundamental advantage in that situation. An understanding of corners and the lines of sight between you and your team and the enemy tanks and their team is super vital to win consistent damage trades and really get the leg up on a lot of tanks that aren't paying attention to these things. Now, next up, I alluded to it, but it's the idea of objectives versus space. There are going to be times when a tank is not running straight to the objective. I understand that you want to cap an objective and that's the ultimate goal, but most of the time that is something that becomes a product of you winning a team fight. You typically want to win a fight, wipe the enemy team, and then capture any objectives. And you're going to have many team fights throughout the course of a round or a game. And there's actually a common saying that goes, you won the battle, but you lost the war, right? And so an idea behind this is you just run straight to point, and maybe you won the battle because you capture a tick, but because you didn't contest someone on the high ground, a Punisher that's set up in a turret location, or just something that needed to be contested or dealt with, you lose the fight. So you won the battle because you got the tick on the objective, but you lost the war and you all got wiped for no value. Your opponent's got more ultimates than you, and then you're going to lose the next fight and then the next fight, and you lose the game. Remember all those strengths that we talked about with tanks, how they have extra health and mitigation? This means that they can go to certain areas that other characters would have to risk their life to go to. Like, let me give you an example. Let's say that there's a Hela sitting on a high ground bridge all by herself. Now, if you're Spider-Man, or if you're Black Panther, or even if you're Mantis, anyone that wants to contest that person, they could risk their life. The Hela could stun them and shoot them, and I'm not saying they shouldn't at some points to risk their life, but you got to understand that anyone who wants to force that Hela off that bridge has to risk their life to do so. But if the Hela isn't forced off that bridge, she's going to sit there and shoot your entire team. So someone has to do it. But is a Thor or a Hulk or a Venom likely to die, if at all, if they are contesting the Hela, if the Hela is solo, no, they're not likely to die. And this is one of the big core responsibilities of a tank, is forcing enemies away from the areas they want to control so that you can have an easier fight eventually. So instead of beelining right to point, you're going to control this high ground, you're going to control that one, you're going to force someone off of this position so that now it's a lot easier for your team to walk up, help you, so that you don't just push straight to point, ignore that Hela, now your team have to fight her, the teammates die to her, and maybe they finally kill her, but you could have prevented that death, you could have forced her away, you could have helped your team get in so that they could help you when you're finally contesting the objective. Understand that there's a lot of responsibilities around tanking, but if you do these things right, you set up a very difficult position for the opponents, and you always set up favorable matchups for your team. So that's why I think tanking is one of the hardest carry roles, because really, if you're setting this up, you could have much worse DPS and supports, but you make their job so much easier that you're winning, and they're performing well because you are creating this opportunity for them. Like, you could be doing the wrong thing all the time, and maybe if you have an amazing DPS or support, they could just contest that Hela, kill them, and it's no problem. But why even force them to do that? Why even force your teammates to overperform when it's something that you could have done risk-free? Now, you DPS players, you're not getting off easy either, and we have a lot of tips that's going to help you become a better DPS, whether you're maining it or filling it. These are the vital tips for you. The first thing that you need to think about is, what is the objective for your composition? There are a lot of DPS to choose from, and if you're just randomly choosing them all the time, even if you have 3 different mains, you're probably doing something wrong, because every single composition wants to accomplish something different, and you can play a DPS, either change up your playstyle or play a specific DPS that helps your team accomplish their goals. So what are the different types of compositions? The first one is a sort of dive composition, which is characters that want to jump onto the enemies. Typically, they want to go in on the backline, assassinate supports, strategically target enemies, and they are going to use their mobility to do so. Now, there's compositions like poke, which is typically trading damage from range, poking from a far distance, and whittling down the enemy's resources. And there's brawls, which are compositions that want to get up close personal, typically fight people closer on the front line. Although these are terms that have been used in past hero shooters, they don't perfectly align, but understand where and how your teammates want to fight. Are they going in mobility style? Are they going to be fighting from a mid-range? Or are they going to be poking from distance? Now, the easiest way to identify this is what tanks are your teammates playing. Like, if you have a Venom and a Hulk, these characters are characters that are going to want to jump in and go into the backline. So if you don't play a character that kind of helps with that game plan, then you are creating an anti-synergy. And let me explain exactly why that could be a problem. Let's say you have a Venom and you have that Hulk and they jump into the backline on a Mantis and a Luna. What are they baiting out? They're baiting out heal, they're baiting out both sleeps, they're baiting out all these cooldowns. Does that mean they can get a kill? Probably not, but now the entire backline on the enemy team doesn't have any cooldowns to stop pretty much anyone. So if you're a Black Panther or a Psylocke or Magic or any character that could jump the backline, guess what? Nothing will stop you, and you could go crazy. All those sleeps and stuns, you don't have to worry about them at all. But what if you're like a Punisher? Or what if you're like a Hawkeye? Well, you could certainly just aim at stuff and kill things normally and still win the game. You understand that all the value that your teammates are creating, all the value that your tanks are creating by baiting out those cooldowns, are not being followed up by you. And the fact that the supports can use their cooldowns, get the tanks off them, and then go back to doing their job, not worried about being pressured any further, is something that you have created by not synergizing with the tank. And I'm not saying you always have to synergize once again, but it is something to think about. You might be making a game harder on yourself. Even if your tanks are playing good and you are as well, you might lose that game because of that anti-synergy. Now, let's say you really want to play Punisher and you're still playing a dive. What can you do to actually still be effective? And typically, it comes down to trying to time your engages and your pressure to correspond with how your team is engaging. So if the dive is going in on the supports at that same time, you want to be trying to time your aggressive engagements. Maybe you go in on a zip, maybe you go for an aggressive angle, maybe you're trying to get line of sight on the supports, or you're just generally doing damage to other things while the supports are occupied. Understand that if you could at least correspond the pressure at the same time, then you are going to be adding more problems than the opponents can solve. If you are fighting when your tanks are not fighting, or maybe if you are playing super safe when your tanks are playing aggressive, then you are creating more anti-synergy and you are making the job harder on you and probably losing the fight for your team. Now, you can't always have a perfect composition, but I would suggest trying to sync up with one other person. Know what your tank is doing, know what someone else on your team is doing, and try to find a way to do the same thing as them so you can try to overwhelm a certain character's utility and breakpoints together and create some sizable advantage. The number 2 is prioritize living over plays. And I think that everyone knows DPS players can die and feed the most, but it's actually a reasonable thing for DPS players to die more than tanks and supports. And the reason is because everything they do is more risky. Every time they go on an off angle, they push up, they make a play, they are taking a risk. They can't play in the back the entire game because then they're giving up an angle. They're giving up certain areas. And it's really important for a DPS to control the off angles of a fight. Like, have you ever played a game where you're all played together and there's always like a constant flanking Black Panther, and maybe there's like someone like a flanking Hela, and there's all these characters like all around you, and it's to the right, to the left, behind? That's because none of the angles and the flank routes and the area around the map are controlled. And we talked about with tanks how they're supposed to create space, but tanks can't be everywhere. They can't stop everything. They can't hold off everything at all times, but a DPS can take control of these little flank areas. And ideally, they take control of them and they're still within line of sight of their supports in the backline. And they're controlling and trading and fighting on these off angles. But that being said, they are weaker than tanks. They're more likely to die. And when they're taking these angles, when they try to take an angle on an enemy, they are also being subjected to potentially dying. So as a DPS, I understand you can die and there are a lot of risks you're taking, but it's important to be very real about the deaths you're having, because at the end of the day, having low deaths on a DPS allow you to impact many more fights, and if you're dying a lot, you're making a fundamental error in the way that you are being aggressive. You are not taking an off angle, which is something adjacent to your team, but within line of sight, ideally, of your team. You are flanking too much. You are isolating yourself too much. You are fighting battles where no one can help you, and you're not doing the job of controlling angles to help your team progress and potentially create plays and have fights from multiple angles on the map. You are just going in all in for the kill, and you're trying to be the hero every single fight. Now, the biggest problem with this is what you're actually doing is creating a lot of 1v2s and 1v3s, where you are trying to fight many people on the enemy team and then complaining to your team why there's no one to help you, why there's no one to assist you in that, but you yourself are the one that is isolating these fights. This means that if you're ever trying to full commit to a fight, you're ever trying to fully flank, you're ever trying to commit without your team, you need to consider that you're not going to get any help. You're probably not going to be able to get any help. So don't commit to these plays unless you're confident you can pull them off without the assistance of your team. Because if you're going all in and creating these angles that are impossible for your team to help you in, then that's a huge risk, but there needs to be a chance for a reward. And you can't be relying on your teammates to just catch up to you, push past all of the angles and the flanks and everything and get to you, because they are not going to be taking the same positions as you, because you're a DPS that is taking these aggressive angles, and they are either a support that's taking the back angles and holding back and being more passively positioned, or they're tanks that are contesting other tanks, objectives, or generally taking central space. Now, I do realize that a lot of these concepts are pretty complicated: tank, DPS, and support, and this is meant to be a more advanced guide, but to give you more visual examples of the thought process of tanks, DPS, and supports, you're going to want to subscribe to my second channel, because I'll be posting some VOD reviews and breakdowns of high-level players and inside the mind of plays that I make in my games that you can incorporate in yours. So definitely subscribe, but let's get back into the video. Now, to kind of give you a wake-up call in this regard, go into your replays, look at games that you lost and games that you had like over 10 deaths, and look at every single death you had. There are going to be so many deaths that you didn't need to have that you misplayed for, and you're going to learn a lot from them. Now, the next one is effective range, and you need to understand that every hero has their own effective range that they really want to fight in, right? A Black Panther wants to fight in super close effective range. A Hawkeye wants to fight in really far effective range, and you need to create, ideally, a ranged mismatch with opponents in matchups if you want to win. So as an example, if you are a Black Panther up against a Hawkeye, then you want to get close in the gap, right? You do not want to be peeking that Hawkeye from any range besides right on top of him. That means you're routing around the map, you're getting tricky with your flank routes, and you're not peeking him in open space. The more times you allow him to see you when you're not in your effective range, the more you risk death for no reward. I want you to hear me now, because this is really, really important. You are peeking people that you should not be peeking. You are subjecting yourself to unnecessary risk all the time when you are not fully committed to creating that ranged mismatch. Now, even in some lesser examples, let's say I'm playing Punisher or Bucky up against a character like Heller or Hawkeye. I do not want to set up a long distance fight with these characters because over time, they will have slightly more impact or even massively more impact than me, and I want to fight them in closer ranges. In fact, I would much rather, as a Bucky, right, fight a Hawkeye or Hela from like 2 feet away than from 40 feet away, because they are gonna win that fight a massive percentage of the time when I'm fighting in their preferred range. And you got to think about it like every hero has a range they would like to kind of fight in, and you want to kind of put yourself in a situation where you're fighting in a range that your character is okay with fighting in and the opponent's character does not want to fight in, if at all possible, and then trying to find ways to fight in the way you want to. Like if I'm Punisher, I'm not gonna fight in open areas. I'm gonna use corners, I'm gonna use cover, I'm gonna play an adjacent angle and maybe shoot at the front line, look to take it off angle on these characters, a closer off angle, or I'm gonna wait until they come closer before I fight them and not from range. Understanding this concept allows you to at least give yourself a chance even in quote-unquote bad matchups and forcing proper engagements with characters that on paper you have some weakness to. The last step is about setting up fight win conditions. And a win condition is the thing that you can use to create a big enough advantage in a fight that you will just win the fight outright. And a lot of DPS have ultimates that can do just that, but there are so many things that can shut you down, whether it's abilities, whether it's ultimates, specifically ultimates like Mantis ult, Cloak and Dagger ult, or of course Luna Snow ult. These ultimates make it so that you will lose the fight when you try to use them. Like you have a Psylocke ult, you pop it, it's not going to kill anything through a Luna Snow ult. You pop your Black Panther ult, it's gonna get completely shut down. You pop Arm and Dangerous, it's gonna get completely shut down. So what do? How do you use your ultimates to win fights when opponents have ultimates like this that can shut you down? You first need to identify that these are things that are gonna shut you down potentially, and then you need to try your best to try to bait it out. And how can you bait out an ultimate? Well, by applying a lot of pressure. So let's say I go in a fight really hard as Winter Soldier. I'm going to take an aggressive off angle. I'm going to shoot at the Luna Snow. I'm going to try to grip her. Maybe I do. Maybe she pops her ultimate and then I die. Well, you might be like, wow, you lost the fight. That sucks. Well, guess what? They used their ultimate and I didn't use mine. So the next fight, I'm going to walk in. I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to pop my ultimate and I'm going to wipe the whole team, because in the previous fight, I made a plan to, at the very least, bait out the ultimate. Now, maybe you just apply a little bit of pressure and they use their ultimate, and this is something that happens the lower in rank you go. Players will use ultimates in situations they shouldn't, and especially support players will panic a lot, which will be a tip we'll talk about in the supporting role, where if they're under pressure, you can often force them to make the wrong play and set up your win condition. But if every time you have your ultimate, you're just like, oh, I'm just gonna hope they don't got it, and just pop in, walk in, pop your ultimate, that you're just asking to get shut down and then not creating any definitive value with your ult, and that's not how you win games at all. Now, last but certainly not least, we got to talk about the support role. And the first tip right off the bat has to do with heal bots versus supports. And one of the things that players will tell you to do, DPS players, tank players, everyone will tell you to do, heal me more, heal. They'll talk about healing all the time. Why are you healing me? Where's my healing? Why didn't you keep me alive? Blah, 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 blah. And I'm here to tell you that you should not listen to them. And I know that they might be listening to this right now and they're going to get pissed off, but hear me out here. You have a job to heal your team and keep them alive, but that is not your only job. Supports can do a ton of damage. Supports have crazy utility that can create advantages, like damage boost, for instance, on Mantis. Supports have some of the best utility in the game that can mitigate plays, create plays, and overall win a team fight. And at the end of the day, it's all about winning team fights. This means that you need to heal and output a lot of healing, but not neglect the other stuff too. Healing is important, but it's only one way that a support can get value, and if you can neglect the other ways, you're going to end up with these 30,000 healing games that you lose over and over and over again. And I'm going to tell you something that's super important. Doing more damage as a support and increasing the damage output of your team in its entirety actually applies more pressure to the enemy, which can mitigate team damage over time. This is actually super important because let's go back to like a Hela or a Hawkeye or a Punisher. If they're just left on a high ground uncontested, just outputting damage, how much damage could they do? Like a ton of damage. They could consistently do damage to do damage. And you are constantly healing and healing and healing and healing and healing, and it's like a hole at the bottom of a boat that never gets like fixed, right? You're scooping the water out, heal, scooping the water out, heal, and it keeps filling with more water and more water and more water. But guess what? If you, as any support, would have just, shot the person, helped someone get that person off, or maybe healed the person that directly contests that Punisher as a hypothetical, then that person leaves and that pressure is gone, which means that your team doesn't need the constant pocket and you're more open to do other things. I think that a lot of players get super mad when they see supports not only healing, but a good support that actually can help to alleviate the pressures of the enemy team, make it so you don't need as much healing to actually win. And you'll often win convincingly. And that's why when you have these games that you just stomp the enemy team, I want you to go look at your support's healing output. How much healing are they actually doing? Because it's going to be a lot less. And the games that you get stomped and you look at your support's healing, most of the time they're healing a lot more. And it's because supports are in a situation where they're under so much pressure, their team is under so much pressure, that they feel like they have no choice but to heal bot. And I'm telling you as a support that you can set the pace here. You can dictate a lot of things by the way you play, because players quickly adapt to the way you play right off the bat. And if they see you as a support that is just only healing and pocketing, they feel like they can just stand in open space. They feel like they can constantly trade blows with the enemy tanks because you're just going to wipe it away. You're just going to heal it up. And there are going to be moments where you should do this, and there are going to be moments where you should heal. But I would urge you to try to be more proactive with the way that you are dealing your damage. Try to be more proactive with the way that you are actually taking fights and using your utility on enemies rather than just kind of being this heal person. Even if your teammates are frustrated all the time at you, I promise they can be frustrated in silver and gold, and you can be thriving in a higher rank than them by utilizing everything a support has to offer. Now, for the next thing, you need to not put yourself in compromised positions where you have an ult. We talked about win conditions of a fight, but supports have anti-win conditions, or things that can stop opponents' win conditions, especially Luna Snow, especially Mantis, especially Cloak and Dagger. These are characters that can stop enemies' offensive ultimates and can shut down a win condition, meaning that you can win a fight. So if you use these in situations that you need them, and then there's nothing to stop your opponent's ultimates, then you have cost your team the game. So once again, let's go back to the flip side of that DPS example. Remember that DPS that I talked about that wants to punish you and force you to use your ultimate so that they can use theirs? It's your job to make it so that does not happen. And how do you make it so that you do not get your ultimate forced? Well, you need to position a lot more safely. You need to know when your opponents have an ultimate, you need to know that they're going to be tunnel visioning you extra hard. So you need to try not to isolate yourself, and you need to be incredibly patient and diligent about using your ultimate, because understand that in this situation, if you pop your ult too early, then you lost the game already. That's the checkmate that they want for you. What I really want you to ask yourself is, how do I position in a way that I'm not forced to use my ultimate? If you can position that way, then you can make it so that it's much harder for the enemy team to force you to use it, and then you can use it to stop the ultimates that are coming. Now, for instance, like if you're on the front line as a tank and you're trading blows, and your Luna just pops their ultimate, even if it's to save you, oftentimes it's the wrong play. And the reason that it's the wrong play is that you win the battle to lose the war, the analogy that we talked about earlier. But going back to the understanding of healbots versus supports, one of the things that a support can do that is super strong is actually controlling off angles with the DPS. And this is the trap that a lot of supports fall into, where they worry too much about their heal stats, they worry too much about healing in general, and they're just going to stick with their tanks 24/7. They're following their tanks around like a lost puppy. But understand that if you can control the off angles and generate a play for somebody, then you can win the fight. It doesn't matter about your overall healing. And let's talk about the off angles that DPS take, which are angles adjacent from your team. They're on the off flanks, they're on the lurks, they're off the edges of the map. And understanding that if you are there with the DPS, they can't be forced out of a position. Like, let me give you this example. If I'm a Hela and I'm on this far off angle, then if I take a little bit of damage and I'm at free of death, what do I have to do? I have to run away. I have to go find a health pack. I have to go back with my team. I have to get back to my supports. So that means that I can no longer take this angle. But if I'm allowed to take this angle, eventually I will get some value. I'll kill somebody. I'll generate some advantage. Maybe I'll win the fight for my team. And if opponents don't directly come and contest me, then they're going to lose to me unless they actually shoot me off that angle. But if I have a support with me, I cannot be shot off this angle. And guess what? If a tank comes in solo at me, a DPS comes in solo at me, what are they doing? They're putting themselves in a 2v1 situation with you and the DPS, shutting down that person very, very easily. Unless they send multiple people at you, they're going to just die. So not only are you holding a really strong angle that forces enemies to just be under ton of pressure and maybe even die, but if they try to shoot you off the angle, you're going to get healed. And if they try to dive you off the angle by themselves, they're going to get killed by both of y'all. So this is something that you can do on a support. And on this off angle, are you actually going to be doing a lot of healing? No, you're healing your DPS when they get low. Are you going to be doing a lot of damage? Yeah, you're probably going to be adding damage and outputting damage from the same spot of your DPS. This means that you are not making a heal-based play here. You are making a pressure-based play and a sustain-based play, but you're not doing it based on outputting freaking 5,000, 10,000 healing. That's not the goal here. But can this create a win condition that the opponents can't overcome? Yes, 100% of the time, and it's something that's done all the time in high level, but in low level, a DPS takes it off angle, and the supports never go with them. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't responsibilities for a support and the responsibilities that involve healing. There are. So when are the core responsibilities for a support? What are they? And one of the things that you're supposed to do is always top people up when they come back from being proactive or making a play. The second your Thor or your tank or whatever comes back to you from being out and being proactive, they need to get topped up right away so they can return to be back. And you need to be ready to top them up in case they are being, actively pursued or trying to be killed. You not being aware that they're there is something that can happen where they're back, but you're not ready for it, and then they die. That could be a really bad situation. Another thing is when your DPS are either coming back or when they're actively in a fight. Any one person that is actively in a fight, in a line of sight that you can see, you should be helping that person. Like, you want to create situations where, let's say your DPS is in a 1v1, make the fight easier for them by making it so that your DPS is getting constant assistance and their DPS is not, and even if your DPS is worse, they're going to win that fight. Like, a support has all these options where they can add damage to situations, they can add healing to situations, they can create a situation where your teammate can't lose a 1v1 or it's very hard for them to do so, and this is what you need to be out for. This is what you need to be looking out for, and it can happen across the entire battlefield. Like, as a support, you have the capability to impact any single fight your teammates are having, but at the end of the day, the healing is a tool to generate an advantage. It's not necessarily something that you need to autopilot to, or else you're missing the point here. The point is to generate an advantage that allows you to get kills, get advantage, win team fights, not just stack up those numbers. And I keep harping on this because I keep getting people pop in my chat that say, I've healed X amount, why can't I win? I healed X amount, why can't I get out of bronze? I've healed X amount, why can't I get out of silver? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much you healed. It's not gonna make you a better support player by focusing on these stats. Doesn't mean you don't heal. It means you understand what it does for your team, when to do it, and when to go for other things or do other things or try to do other things, because that's how you carry. Another thing that you should consider as a support is, while you definitely want to prioritize your life and be safe, you need to be ready to pivot on a proactive play by your team. Like, if your tanks are going in, your DPS is going in because y'all have picks, you as a support can also go in and also be proactive and also give up your positioning. You're not playing safe all the time here. You are willing to pivot in and give up your safe positioning when your team is being proactive, because you don't want to create a situation where your tanks and DPS are going in to try to close out a fight, because, like, let's say they killed 2-3 people, they're going in to close out a fight, but because you're scared and staying back and being super passive, your teammates are actually putting themselves in like a 2v3 situation or a 3v4 situation, when really, if the entire team went in and capitalized and collapsed on the enemy, there's no way they could win because y'all had an advantage, but you didn't add to that team fight because you stayed back. Simultaneously, when things collapse, you can add a giant burst of healing and damage that can stabilize your team and help y'all close out the fight, and that's super, super important to understand to do. Now, I understand that these were a lot of complex topics in this video. We've been putting out a lot of simple guides. I wanted to put out something more complex that gives you something to chew on. But if you have anything that you don't understand in this video, definitely let me know in the comments down below, and I'll definitely get right on it in responding as soon as possible. And you're definitely going to want to check out the second channel and subscribe, because we're going to be doing follow-ups to this video, breaking down gameplay and thought process on tank, DPS, and support. So you're going to want to see that channel so that you don't miss out on those guides and all the other content we do on that channel as well. But thank you so much for coming by. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.